Thank you for joining us for today's HPL seminar. As a quick announcement, I would like to remind everyone that we are looking for speakers for the new semester moving forward from Jan to June. And so people that have exciting research to share, this is a great platform to do that. So please email me. I'm organizing that schedule. And so reach out and I would love to put you down as a presenter for the new year. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Chris Tiessen, who is an undergraduate student in the Herzog Lab. Chris has been working with Dr. Herzog for 3 years, and he is currently in his final year of his undergraduate degree, which is in cellular, molecular, and microbial biology. He is now also working on his honors thesis, which is specifically in parasitology, looking at lymph node macrophage interactions. Today, Chris will be presenting his work on molten state immunoglobulin domain dynamics. And with that, I will pass it to Chris for his presentation. But right before the talk, I actually chatted with Chris about a fun fact about him. And so he used to be a dodgeball athlete and he tore his shoulder, I believe, after which he actually used some of his techniques in research to do immunoglobulin testing on himself. And so maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that during his presentation today.
Let me just adjust this. Yeah, so immunoglobulin domains are this big injury prevention mechanism, we think. And so if you tear a muscle or almost tear a muscle, that's when they really come into play. So that's what that's about. I want to start out talking about when muscles stretch, because today I'm going to talk about passive muscle mechanics. And I want to first kind of establish why this is important. Like, why should we be looking at passive muscle mechanics? Because everyone, if you think of muscle, we think of actin and myosin, we think of contraction. But every time one of your muscles contracts, it's usually opposed by an antagonistic muscle. And that antagonistic muscle is in passive extension. So for example, if I contract my tricep, my bicep is going to be in passive extension. And so during locomotion, like when you're walking, when you're moving, your muscles are constantly in active and passive extension. So in general, passive extension occurs due to external forces. So you can think of these as forces generated by antagonistic muscles. And muscles are viscoelastic. And what that means is that they both store energy and dissipate energy during this type of extension. So if you think about it like this, my bicep is stretching, it's storing energy. Even though I'm not contracting my bicep, it's also losing some of that energy. And some of that energy is lost as heat, some of it is lost as deformation, and that's actually the primary source of loss. But the reason why we care about this is because the storage and release of energy contributes to the efficiency of movement. It also contributes to the efficiency of things like, you can think about it like, when am I moving my joints? Why would it be important for it to be efficient? So let's say I'm like running a race or something like that. It would be important for me to be as efficient as possible. And so passive storage of energy actually helps us recuperate some energy during movement. So let's say I move my bicep, my tricep is storing energy. Now when I move back, it's releasing that energy back into the system. So how do we generate passive force? Passive force in muscle really comes from two main sources. At the level of skeletal muscle, it comes from the extracellular matrix, which is primarily collagen. It also comes from things like surrounding connective tissues. You have the fascia around the muscle. There's all sorts of different type of connective tissue elements that help generate passive force. But what I want to talk about is what generates passive force within a muscle, and that's titin. So I put muscle cell here. You can assume it's a skinned muscle cell. So titin is essentially a giant spring protein. It's the largest protein in your body, and it's responsible for passive force generation in muscle. So if I just had muscle, no connective tissue at all, and I stretched it, it's going to store energy, and titin is going to be the protein that stores that energy. And titin, I need to go back here. Titin, I put a hill type type model figure here. Hill type models are usually at a bigger scale than this. So the reason I put it here is just because Titin acts as a passive spring element. And what that means is that when you contract muscle, that generates force. But depending on the length of your muscle, the Titin is also generating force as a parallel spring element. Okay, so I study muscle at the level of myofibrils, and these are essentially the fundamental contractile unit of muscle. So you can see in this image here, there's individual sarcomeres aligned end to end. And the advantage of myofibrils is we have no connective tissue. These are subcellular. And basically the mechanical properties that we derive from myofibrils come from the sarcomeres alone. So it's just a chain of sarcomeres, there's nothing else to it. And so then if we look at the mechanical properties, we can say, oh, that comes from the sarcomeres because there's literally nothing else it can possibly come from. So where does Titin come into this? So if we look at an individual sarcomere, that sarcomere is composed of a few elements. So there's the myosin thick filament, there's the actin thin filament that you're probably familiar with. This is a spring element called Titin. So Titin is huge. I'll give you just like, I don't know, most proteins are around 40, 50 kilodaltons. Titin is about 4 gigadaltons. So it's way, way, way bigger than most proteins. And it actually stretches from the Z line all the way to the M line here. But this region is called I-band Titin. And that is the extensible region of Titin. So when I talk about Titin stretching, I'm talking about this region of Titin stretching. And this stores and dissipates energy when your muscles are stretched passively. So we think that within a myofibril and within a sarcomere, Titin provides essentially all of the passive force. And this has been supported, I don't know, some of you may have been here. This is actually work done in part by Song Wan, who actually presented this in her seminar about 2 years ago, where they actually cleaved Titin during a myofibril experiment to show that Titin is responsible for all passive force. And you can see a very distinct difference here when they cleave Titin. And so Titin is responsible for almost all of passive force. There's a little bit of passive force that is not by Titin, and that comes from other elements, kind of just linking things together. But in general, when we're looking at myofibril passive tension, it comes from Titin. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the components of Titin and think about how this works. So there's kind of 4 regions here. The first is the proximal immunoglobulin domains. And it says differentially spliced. That's just because in different muscle tissues, there's different numbers of them. But there's proximal immunoglobulin domains. Then we have the N2A region, which is primarily involved in signaling. We think it might also bind actin. PEVK is a spring-like region, and the distal immunoglobulin domains they're in general pretty similar to the proximal immunoglobulin domains. And so all of this together is the extensible region of Titin. So when Titin is stretched, this is the region of Titin that's stretched. So let's talk about each of those things individually. So the PEVK region here is elastic, and it's primarily responsible for physiological force generation. So what that means is when your sarcomeres are at physiological lengths, so lengths I can actually put my bicep at, it's primarily the PEVK that would be responsible for force generation. And the PEVK is almost completely elastic. And this kind of makes sense if you think about it, like evolutionarily, because you want something to be as efficient as possible during physiological extension and relaxation. Then there's the immunoglobulin domains, and the immunoglobulin domains in the proximal region and the distal region are quite similar. There's some evidence that suggests these ones might be more difficult to unfold. But the proximal immunoglobulin domains unfold at very high forces. So as we stretch Titin to very long lengths, we eventually can unfold these immunoglobulin domains. These little things there, that represents like a disulfide bond. And that's what is breaking when they're unfolding. So there's a disulfide bond that breaks apart, and that contributes length to tighten. And so you can think of this as like kind of like a spring, and these like clasps that can come undone. I put the N2A region here. It's not extensible, so we don't need to worry about that to generate force. Okay, so let's talk about the PBK region specifically. So the PBK region in rabbit psoas is composed of around 800 amino acids. It's actually quite variable in different tissues. So for example, in a rat, it has about 1400. The reason why I put rabbit psoas is all of my work is done on rabbit psoas. So that's the data I'll be showing you. It doesn't have any bonding, which means that it coils. It doesn't make any bonds between the protein chains. There's no disulfide bonds between the cysteine residues or anything. It just coils, and it's actually electrostatic attraction that keeps it together and what generates force when it's lengthened. It's highly elastic and it's nonlinear, and this means that when we stretch it and then it subsequently shortens, it returns back almost all of the energy we've put into it. So the PBK region, because it is a nonlinear spring that is highly elastic, it can actually be modeled very effectively using something called a worm-like chain model. And I'm going to put the equation here, but I'll kind of explain it conceptually instead of mathematically so that everyone can kind of understand what's going on. A worm-like chain model is basically a model for polymer extension. And so it's used for polymer deformation models, and it's often used to model DNA or proteins. And basically the idea is if I have a polymer substance and I only consider it down a single axis, and then I consider how it deforms, that's what a worm-like chain model describes. And so if you modify this model, it's been shown in the literature that this very, very effectively models PBK. And the only thing you really need to see in this graph is that these points here correspond very, very closely to what they call the entropic enthalpic model. And so basically we can use this equation to very accurately represent the PBK section. And that'll be important later because I want to talk about the immunoglobulin domain. So let's talk about the proximal immunoglobulin domains. So the proximal immunoglobulin domains, they can unfold at high forces and they can refold again at low forces. But some evidence suggests they may be able to refold at physiological forces. And the reason why this is important is because this might be an energy recovery mechanism where if we have any unfolded immunoglobulin domains, they can refold under force and they can actually recover some energy from your muscle, making your movement more efficient. And the mechanism for why they're able to refold at physiological forces is something called the Molten state. So this is the title, but I'll explain what this is. Basically, you have a folded immunoglobulin domain and an unfolded immunoglobulin domain. And the initial idea is that those are the only two conformations we can have with an immunoglobulin domain. It has to be fully folded or fully unfolded. And there's some sort of activation energy involved. So there's a force threshold where as I pull on a muscle, I'm going to increase the energy basically available to that bond, which is eventually going to break that bond. The idea of a molten state is maybe there's kind of like a partially unfolded state. And the reason why this is proposed is lots of different proteins have something called a molten state. So if you look at protein folding energetics, lots of them have like a folded, unfolded, and a bunch of in-between states. And the idea is, well, maybe some of these immunoglobulin domains, they can kind of sort of unfold a little bit. Oops. They can kind of sort of unfold a little bit, and then they can go back between folded and molten state. And this would contribute length, and this would contribute work if they were able to go back and forth between these states more easily because the activation energy threshold is lower. And so that's what's been proposed. It really hasn't been shown that this is actually the case. There's a couple experiments on individual immunoglobulin domains. Unlike, I think I-91, someone has shown it in a rat psoas that it looks like there's a molten state, but no one's ever really shown that at the level of a myofibril. So in terms of the distal immunoglobulin domains, basically these are in general understudied, likely just because there's way less of them. But they probably behave somewhat similarly to the proximal domains, although there's some evidence that they have higher thresholds for unfolding. So basically, if we do see any unfolded immunoglobulin domains, they're probably in the proximal region. Okay, so this kind of leads me to the end of the background, and this is the important part right here. So we can measure the length of a sarcomere. And with the length of the sarcomere, we know the length of Titin because it's visible. It's only in the I band of the sarcomere. So if we look at the I band of a sarcomere, we can say exactly how long this whole protein is. We can model the PEVK and say exactly how long the PEVK is at a given force. And so what we can do is we can say we have the total length and we have the PEVK length. Now we can figure out the length of the immunoglobulin domains. And that allows us to figure out a lot of different parameters about the immunoglobulin domains because we have their length and we have the force on the myofibril. And so we can figure out how much work immunoglobulin domains are contributing. We can figure out when they're refolding, and a bunch of other things that I'll show you. The one thing I want to note here is that if we do it like this, we actually don't differentiate between the proximal and the distal immunoglobulin domains. And that's because we don't have a length value for this, and we don't have a length value for this. We just have a total length value. And so, you know, everything I say about immunoglobulin domains, that's going to be applicable to all of them, not just to one part of them. But we also don't know, like potentially all of the unfolding is happening here, and we wouldn't be able to say. We can just say in general, this is what's going on. So what we wanted to test is if Titin's immunoglobulin domains will be able to refold under force and produce work. And so this has been indicated by single molecule experiments. These are the papers that have proposed the idea of the molten state. We also think that this will occur quickly and observably during shortening. And that's just based off of some preliminary experiments we did where you can see myofibrils develop. You know, if you stretch them, they go, and then shorten them, they go slack, and then they stop being slack. I didn't include the video, maybe I should have. But anyway, we can kind of see around what time they're gonna take. So here's how I tested this. I took 6 myofibrils, and all of them are paired tests. And I did 2 kind of main protocols. So the first was an immediate shortening. And so we stretched from a length of 2.7 microns per sarcomere to 4.5 microns per sarcomere. And this length is super duper long. So if you're not familiar with it, your sarcomeres during physiological movement are kind of operating between, let's say, 2.1 and maybe all the way up to 3 microns per sarcomere. So this is a very, very long length. The reason why is we want to ensure that we have immunoglobulin domains unfolded. And we want to unfold as many as possible because then we can actually look at them. Then we did 3 different shortening speeds. 3 different shortening speeds. So one of them very quick, one of them a little bit slower, one of them 10 seconds. So there's 0.2, 2 seconds, 10 seconds. Then we did the exact same thing, except we waited until steady state force was reached before we shortened. I've said 30 seconds here. Steady state was usually achieved after about 12 seconds, but we just held till 30 just to ensure we'd reach steady state force in all cases. And the idea here was that if we have this molten state happening, it's probably associated with some sort of time constant. And that's just based off of what we know about other proteins. So if we have a lower activation energy, it's going to be quicker for an immunoglobulin domain to go into the molten state than if we have a higher activation energy. And so the idea was maybe with the immediate shortening, we can access that. we can access the molten state, so we'll see predominantly molten state behavior, whereas the steady state, we're gonna see predominantly full unfolding, refolding behavior, or at least that was the idea. That's not what we saw. So this first graph shows the energy we recovered from immunoglobulin domains with each of the protocols. And you'll notice that the 0.2 seconds is missing from this. And this is because the 0.2 seconds essentially was not able to be analyzed in this way because we had some data artifacts because we only have like 3 to 4 frames of images over that very, very short thing. So what we saw here is that immunoglobulin domains recovered positive energy in all cases. There was no effect of the time on shortening, so no effect of how long it took us to shorten, and also no hold effect in terms of the percentage of total work. One thing I do want to note here is this is really small. This is like 2 to 4%. At maximum, it's like around 8%. So we're seeing really small amounts of energy contribution from immunoglobulin domain refolding. This is kind of expected. And the reason why is we know the PEBK is elastic. It is essentially going to be responsible for almost all of our extension and almost all of the energy we recover during shortening. So we get a little bit back from immunoglobulin domain refolding. So what we wanted to look at next was, okay, we get a little bit back. Is it in line with the single molecule Titin experiments? And so this is the average work performed per IG refolding event. So for every length shortening that corresponds to the length of an immunoglobulin domain when it unfolds and refolds. And what I'll just say here is that the literature maximums for individual immunoglobulin domains show refolding at around 6 to 8 piconewtons. And these result in a maximum of 105 dectojoules. So it's like 10 to the negative 21 joules. So it's kind of crazy that we can measure that. But anyway, maximum of 105 zeptojoules. So you'll notice we're actually kind of in the ballpark, which is absolutely wild. And I'll tell you why that's wild. It's basically because there are 3,000 Titin filaments approximately in a myofibril. Each of those filaments has approximately 75 immunoglobulin domains. There's more than just Titin in a myofibril. There's like so many other, proteins and all of this other stuff going on. And we're able to look at only the myofibril force and generate the amount of work for an individual immunoglobulin domain and be relatively in the ballpark that's expected, which is kind of interesting. What's interesting here as well is we saw difference in the work. This is the average work performed per immunoglobulin domain refolding event. We saw differences between the steady state and the intermediate, and the immediate. This was significant for the 2 second and not for the 10 second, but you can still see the trend. This is paired data, which is why it doesn't look significant. Anyway, this maybe we can think of as potential evidence for the existence of a molten state. The reason why is because the immunoglobulin domains in general should behave identically at a given force on the Titin filament. If they are not behaving identically, that indicates something is different about their conformation. But we actually can't tell looking at this level because maybe it's that there were more or less unfolded domains after a steady state hold, and this resulted in slight differences here. So we really can't say just based off of this graph. The last thing is that we can calculate the probability of refolding at each Titin force. And I did this for the 2 second only because that's where we saw significant differences. So the idea here is if these two curves were different, we would be seeing different behavior of immunoglobulin domains. And since we are not, it's essentially, the same for both of them. What that means is that the immunoglobulin domains are behaving the same in a steady state and in an immediate protocol. And so this basically shows that either they're both behaving in molten state or neither of them are behaving in molten state based on, the fact that there's no significant differences in this graph. Okay, so what does this mean? The first thing is that immunoglobulin domain refolding occurs under tension and contributes to energy recovery in muscle. And this is pretty important because this has only ever been shown in individual immunoglobulin domains. It's never been shown in a myofibril. So, especially because a lot of those individual experiments are like a construct of one immunoglobulin domain times 10. So we don't know if that behavior is really applicable in a myofibril. This shows it is applicable in a myofibril. However, the effect of refolding is very small in comparison to other more elastic components like the PEPK region. The second thing is that immunoglobulin domain refolding demonstrated on single molecule experiments can also be seen. So I talked about this, but at physiological forces. So we are seeing refolding at forces that we would see physiologically. And so I'll just go back here. You could think physiologically is kind of like anything under 15 is something we might see physiologically. And we do see positive probabilities of refolding there. So we do see refolding at physiologically relevant forces. The last thing, or I guess second last thing, is we observed low levels of refolding. It may be relevant during movement. One thing I want to say here is that this depends on immunoglobulin domains unfolding. So they can't refold unless they've unfolded. And in general, the amount of unfolding we see at physiological lengths is very low. So we might see a few of them unfolded around 3 at the upper limits, but in general, the vast majority are not going to unfold. And lastly, at the level of the myofibril, it doesn't seem that molten state behavior is evident, and that's really shown by the folding probabilities are exactly the same for both of the protocols. But we actually can't be sure because it could also be the case that both of those protocols are showing molten state behavior, and that's why they're indistinguishable. So I think that's all I have. So thanks to everyone in the lab. And,
Thanks, Chris. Does anyone have any questions to start for Chris? Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering how you got work and the change in the folding, unfolding, refolding from the protocols that you showed us. So I thought there's a missing step here. Could you explain to us how you got the results, like from the protocols? I'm lost.
Okay.
Between the protocols and
Yeah.
the results of the evidence.
Okay, so whenever we do the protocols, we can measure the force in the myofibril. Then we can calculate the force on Titin. And that we can do with the lattice spacing of Titin in the myofibril. That force allows us to model the PEPK and determine the length of the PEPK. So that's how we determine PEPK length. Titin length we can measure visually by looking at the length of the I band. And with those two parameters, we can calculate the length of the immunoglobulin domains. We also have the force on Titin from earlier that we used to do the PEPK. So that gives us the length of the immunoglobulin domains and the force at every time point. And so based on that, then we can calculate the total work performed by immunoglobulin domains based on the length multiplied by the force, so the change in length multiplied by the change in force. And that's going to give us a work value that we can then normalize to the total energy recovered from the myofibril. And that's what this graph represents. And then if we divide the work performed by the number of immunoglobulin domains that have refolded during that period, then we can calculate the average work performed per immunoglobulin domain, if that makes sense.
So why not show also the length of the IG domains? And so here the length is shorter, this means that they are in the molten state as opposed to fully extended. Yeah.
So,
You have that as well?
yeah, so I have the absolute total length of the immunoglobulin domains. The reason I haven't shown it is it doesn't say a lot because we don't know. Because what has been proposed for the molten state is that immunoglobulin domain that's fully folded is around 4.5 nanometers. If it partially unfolds, it's around 13 nanometers. And if it fully unfolds, it's around 25 nanometers. So that gives us 3 possible lengths of an immunoglobulin domain, and we only have the total length, which is an unsolvable system. So I can't tell you how many are in molten state versus unfolded. I can only assume there is no molten state or assume they are all in molten state. So for this, I've assumed that there's no molten state at all for this graph specifically.
I'll ask while people think. Do you mind going back to the previous slide? So I think here, just based on how like other tissues behave, I would have hypothesized initially that you might see some type of rate dependency. Can you explain that? You did give an explanation, but I didn't quite fully understand. Can you explain again why we didn't see effective?
So I don't know, but the probable reason is that these speeds are all slow enough that the immunoglobulin domain refolding happens fast enough that the speed of shortening is not the limiting factor. So if I was then to go down to like a 0.5 seconds, 0.1 second, then I would see less energy recovered by immunoglobulin domains. So basically they refold and unfold according to probabilities. It's like an equilibrium between the two states at, slower speeds. This is going on very rapidly. And so we're probably just kind of getting like a snippet of this is what it looks like as the equilibrium changes across. But you would have to go so fast that it couldn't unfold and refold fast enough to keep up with that.
So is this a result you were expecting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Chris, your decision about whether or not you're gonna see a molten state or not in your condition where you're short-lived at the different speeds is really based on the assumption that there is no molten state refolding occurring if you reach that 4.5 micron length and immediately then go down, right? And that you do have molten states transitioning to refolding during the steady state, or is that your binary model where it's either open or it's closed? I got a little bit lost there.
Okay, yeah, so let me just go back. So the idea is that maybe this favors molten state and this favors full unfolding. We don't know that. So that's the assumption. So,
But just for my sake, on the sarcomere length there on the side, you go from 2.7 to 4.5 on the left. But of course, from 2.7 up to 3.5 is all PDK. So it would just any molten state or any IG domain unfolding would then refold kind of occurs in the top third of this protocol in terms of length.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, so the idea here is, if there's a molten state that occurs, they're only gonna have time to unfold into the molten state before they're already shorter. Whereas here, they have time to unfold into the molten state and then relax into a fully unfolded state. And then we can see them refolding from a fully unfolded state.
And
But that is an assumption, you're right.
And you're thinking then is that it's all PDK until the PDK is extended, and then it's all IG domain unfolding / molten state / refolding.
Kind of,
don't know that
yeah,
those run in
but
parallel.
it's, well, I mean, they do, it's just based off of this. So however long the modeled PDK is, the immunoglobulin domains are whatever is left to make up the length of Titin. And so we do start to see unfolding at like 3, but it's pretty small until the PBK reaches its full length, which is around 3.5 or something like that.
But doesn't the unfolding depend on the force? It could change the speed so that the force is different between the two states.
Yeah, the unfolding is based on the force.
But if you stretch it with the same speed, the same amount, wouldn't they unfold the exact same way during the stretch, but it's just after that it's different?
No, because I'm going the wrong way here. The idea is that here we see viscous behavior. So we see viscoelastic relaxation. And so that we think might be caused by this like slow relaxing from a molten state into a fully open state. Because, I haven't shown that this is essentially the distance trace, the length of the myofibril we input into the machine. But if you were to look at the actual sarcomere length, the sarcomere length is going to creep up a little bit during the whole to a point where it reaches steady state. And during that period, we think it might be relaxing. But again, like all of that it's just what we think might be going on. And what we actually saw was that the refolding in both states was identical in its behavior, showing that either they're both molten state or they're both not.
Any other questions? I'll ask a quick one. You said that Titin is responsible for most of the passive force in the subcellular level. What else takes up that remaining small percentage?
So, I mean, there's a few different things. As you get to very, very long lengths, there's a couple of different proteins, and I'm not 100% current on what those are. Maybe it's Desmond is one, but I'm not entirely sure. But at very long lengths, we start to see other proteins. Their force starts to go up, but even longer than what I'm doing here, like the stakes. There's also, just like other stuff in the way that, potentially could get involved in comparison to an individual isolated type. So there's interactions with the chemical environment that might change stiffness we see between a myofibril and an isolated Titin. And then, depending on what is still stuck on that myofibril, we try and pick up ones that are nice, but if they have like a little thing on the side, that can contribute as well.
Yes.
So you're assuming that the PBK domain is purely elastic, this is the assumption as well, so that during the holding state, there is no change of the length or of the force because of the PBK.
Yeah, so we model it with the worm-like chain model, which is based off of the assumption that the PBK is elastic. So yes.
How accurate is this assumption in your opinion?
I have looked at this, just like at the data that Armand and I have collected, and it looks like we get about 90% of the energy put in is recovered. So, it's not quite fully elastic, it's losing about 10% of the energy. But pretty good.
People have done constructs, like tested constructs of PBK lesion and stretch it and release it and see if there is any loss in energy. Like
I don't know.
construct.
I'm not sure. I know people often do constructs of the poly E. But my guess would be that would not do well because the PBK is like an electrostatic environment that's, if you only had a construct, it's not electrostatically attracted to other parts of the PBK. And so you might not see kind of the spring-like behavior unless you have everything, although I don't know.
But also it's maybe too long for the bacteria, because usually these they are grown in bacteria and then they are purified. So maybe
Yeah,
it's
full
too big.
PBK is 280 nanometers.
I think you touched on this a little bit in your background slides, but can you remind me of like What is the importance of the immunoglobulin domain folding and unfolding?
So we think, in general, it's probably has something to do with injury prevention. So if your muscles are stretched for really long lengths, instead of breaking, these immunoglobulin domains unfold. Also, it appears that they are unfolding a little bit at the very longest physiological lengths. So maybe that's kind of helping. There's also this idea that, and I'm not sure if this is still kind of considered the case, but the PBK is elastic. The idea was that if you unfold an immunoglobulin domain, now you can access the PBK elasticity at a longer muscle length. Although this data doesn't really support that.
So it almost could be like a protective mechanism that it unfolds. But let's say if someone is injured and that unfolding protected them from like fully tearing a muscle or something, would you expect to see that refolding is reduced in that case? Like, could it go to a state where it doesn't come back if they're injured?
So usually no. The refolding would occur. The injury is likely to be not in Titin though. So if you stretched and injured, it would unfold so the Titin wasn't injured, but maybe something else in your muscle was injured at that force because the refolding is force dependent. So as long as Titin is intact and now it's on 0 force, it will refold.
I've got another question. Are the immunoglobulin domains and like how they fold or how much they fold and refold, is that either been shown or is it suspected to be altered by like a disease or injury, and how so?
I don't know about a disease or injury, to be honest. I think it's very uncommon and also very difficult to show immunoglobulin domain unfolding in vivo because it's hard to get your muscles that long. One thing that is interesting is that as the pH of a muscle is lower, there's some evidence that immunoglobulin domains unfold more regularly. So like purely speculatively, if someone, I don't know, did some very, very intense cardio and had a lot of lactic acid in the muscle, maybe as an injury prevention mechanism, they're more ready to unfold and protect that muscle. Yeah, I don't know about any disease or anything.
Mutations maybe in the Ig domain itself, and then will change its stuff.
So thank you for the presentation. My question is that the muscle fiber is regarded as transversely isotropic. So all these experiments that you were doing were in the axial direction.
Exactly.
So that you are expecting this whole passive force is from the axial direction. So do you say that we shouldn't expect any force in the transverse direction?
So we can only measure axial force. And when we model with the worm-like chain, we're assuming only one dimension, which is the axial dimension of extension. And so I guess you could see changes in transverse forces, but we wouldn't be able to measure them.
So since you are like accounting just Titin for the passive force, and my question was that, so Titin is like in the axial direction.
Yeah.
Right? So if, because again, in the cellular level or in the myofibril level, we are not dealing with any extracellular like matrix or anything.
Nope.
That is like accounting for the passive like force. My question is that why are we like seeing or aren't we seeing the passive force in the transverse direction? Can we see that or not? What do you think?
I mean, I can't see it because I only measure force axially. So with these experiments, I can't say
So
anything
if like
about transverse.
hypothetically you have done like some experiment in the transverse direction, what would be your answer to like, could we see passive force?
So when you stretch a myofibril, deformation occurs. This makes the myofibril get thinner. So I guess you could say there's some sort of transverse force application because of the structural integrity of the myofibril holds itself together, so it remains essentially isovolumetric during that stretch.
So in that case, we cannot like say
But we can't measure
only
this.
Titin is like responsible for all the like 90% of the passive force that you say. Because again, we are seeing passive force in the transverse direction. If we were like doing the experiment in the transverse direction. So we still have like some other passive elements in the like the myofibril level, I think. Because again,
Okay, there are other passive elements in the myofibril level other than Titin. We can't say anything about transverse force because we don't measure it. But yes, there probably are some transverse forces because we remain isovolumetric, which means there has to be transverse force application in order to do that. So yes, but I can't say anything about it. Every assumption here was that we're only dealing with axial force because that's all I can measure.
To be clear, for this discussion, if we're being honest, there doesn't have to be any force in that direction for the change in length that you see in the transverse direction. You can have strain with zero stress. It's all due to the Poisson's ratio. I don't know anything about muscles, so I don't know if there's things that could create force in that direction, but in basic material science, there does not have to be any stress to create that change in strain. So it doesn't have to be force, but I guess it could.
Yeah, could be.
Actually, Titin has been modeled as coming from the A band and up to the where the actin filaments start. So actin is not like Titin is not like axial, purely axial. And so it has some angle with the horizontal
so
direction.
still we
And
can,
so you can,
it's
yeah,
fake
it has
to have
been,
that.
exactly, in some models, has been modeled as having two components to force, transverse component and axial.
Any other questions?
I have a silly question.
I also have a silly question, so you go first.
When you're giving your background of the role of Titin in passive stretch, you have Titin at that whole muscle level. And then you also have it at the level of the myofibril. And so, am I interpreting it right that like, are you just saying that when you stretch a full muscle, Titin contributes to the, okay, but you're not saying that there's Titin at that length scale?
No,
Yeah.
it's one of the contributors. I think it does about 50% at a full muscle scale.
Again, might be a silly question, but when you have 0.2 seconds, 2 seconds, and 10 seconds of shortening, why does the time on there look longer than that? Like, why is it still short? Or is that something else that we could have?
Like, okay, this is broken. Like, it. Here, like we
Yeah.
stretch over 2 seconds and then we shorten during that time. So it's like 2 plus 2 told you. 2 plus 10, 12, 15.
That makes sense. Okay, silly question, like I said.
Any other questions for Chris? Okay, we will end our seminar there. Thank you.